Welcome to this video tutorial on how to use VRay directly within Grasshopper for Rhino. In this video I'm going to be using Grasshopper to control some of VRay's render functions on this model I've got set up in my Rhino scene. This is just a simple model made up of 3 layers here where we've got walls, terrain and a kind of metal objects which we're going to be rendering. Now to begin this tutorial I'm going to start by opening up Grasshopper just by typing in Grasshopper into my command line up here, like so. And then once we've got the Grasshopper file open, we're just going to make a new document there. Now to begin with using some of VRay's tools directly in Grasshopper, we need to go along to the VRay tab. You will only see this if you have VRay installed in your Rhino file here, and once you've got it installed within Rhino, it will also be installed directly in Grasshopper as well. For this tutorial I'm using Rhino 8 and the latest edition of VRay 2. Now to begin with, we need to set up a VRay Render node, and this is essentially the kind of hub of all of our rendering that we're going to be doing within Grasshopper. We can find that just by going to the Render tab here and hovering over this node here, which is the VRay Render node, and it has the little VRay logo on it. To use it, we're just going to click and drag this onto our slate editor here, and that will set up the main render node, which everything will need to plug into in order for our render to work. Now, before we start with this, I'm just going to select my render node and right click on it and click on the show controls option. This will show up some of the kind of default settings that are already set up in this particular node. And you'll see here we're using the CPU to render. We've got a kind of progressive sampler, which means it will sort of build up and it will kind of get more defined and higher quality as longer the time we give it. And also we've got the quality setting here, which is currently set to medium. For the image output, you'll see it's got a little orange box there because it hasn't currently got anywhere to save an output file. So in order to set this, we're just going to double click on that image output. I'm going to choose a folder here, I'm going to choose the render folder, and we're just going to save this as kind of file name number 1 in this folder, like so. Once you've got it set, you'll see it goes green there and it's kind of set now. We've got this output file. So what will happen is when I render out an image, it will automatically save in this folder for me. This is particularly useful when we want to do animations, which we're going to get to at the end of this video. Now from here, you can see if I sort of zoom out a little bit so we can see the model, and we're going to hover our Grasshopper window just over the top here. If I want to render this out, all I need to do is right click on this button and hit the render button there. But what you'll find is when we start to render this, we actually won't be able to see any geometry in the scene to start with. The reason for this is in order to render directly in Grasshopper, we need to tell it exactly which geometry we want to render. By default, it won't detect geometry that's already modeled in our Rhino file. We need to actually bring it in to our Grasshopper window here in order for it to be rendered via this node. Now to do that, we're going to use this little bit here called a VRay Geometry object. If we click and drag this out, you'll see we've got this VRay Geometry piece, and this essentially can store information on geometry that's in our Rhino file in order for it to render out within our Grasshopper window. Now this plugs in to the VRay Geometry option here, and in order to pick up this geometry here, we need to go back to our parameters in Grasshopper and just create one of these brep folders here. Now these essentially are a parameter that can pick up 3D models that we've made within our Rhino space, and these are all polysurface models here as well. What we're going to do is just select all of the models I've got. We're going to right click on here and we're going to set multiple breps there. That's going to pick up all of these models, and the way we can test that is if we click on this option, you'll see it goes green here saying that we've picked up all of those objects there. Now we can rename this if we want to models, so we know, or you can give it something specific if you're trying to pick up certain kind of textures or certain layers within this parameter. And once we've got that, we're just going to plug it into the geometry and make sure that's connected into this VRay Geometry here. Now what will happen if we just sort of center back on the model, and I'm going to go back, and this time I'm going to use the render interactive, which means we can pan around the model as it renders there. You can see in here that I now have my model rendering and it's picking it up within my kind of VRay scene. So that's how we make sure that all of our kind of models are being detected in Grasshopper as we start to render them. Now for the purpose of this tutorial, I'm just going to make these windows a bit smaller and we're going to kind of hover it on the side here so we can see it whilst we're rendering. You'll notice when using kind of Grasshopper VRay in Rhino, you'll end up with a lot of windows like this. Sometimes it's easier if you've got two screens and you can kind of push some windows over to the other side, but for the purpose of this video, I kind of hover these two here, and then we'll have our kind of Rhino window behind that, which we'll kind of go back to if we need to edit in Rhino. Now, we've got our model set in. We've got our kind of basic render properties set up here, and the next thing we're going to do is look at this lighting tab and start to set some more specific lighting in the scene. We can do that just by going into VRay here and having a look under this lighting parameter, and all of the lights that you normally use in VRay can also be found in Grasshopper as well. Now we're just going to move these out the way. We'll move this down slightly. I'm going to open up this lighting tab, and we're going to start by just making a VRay sun here, and this is going to kind of light up the scene a little bit more brightly in my file. Now we've set up this sun, if I just minimize my render frame here and zoom out slightly, you can see it's actually in our scene as this green object here, and it's got a kind of direction, it's also got a rough size and scale there. And those are all set by these kind of options here, this position, target, intensity, etc. Now for sunlight, and we'll just move these around so we've got a bit more space. I don't usually change the intensity, the color, because they're usually kind of preset to work pretty well. And we're going to start just by taking that light option and just plugging it in where it says light here. Now if we go back to our render, go back to that interactive renderer there, and we'll just sort of zoom in, move it across so we can see it a little bit more clearly, like so. There you can see we've got light casting on our object, and this is caused by that sunlight there. Now if we wanted to actually change the direction of the light, we need to change this position option here. And by default, it's got these kind of default values that are already set in there. Now we can actually change this using a vector node here. I'm going to use this construct point vector to change this. By default, this is set to 0, 0, 0, and what will happen if I plug this into the position, it will reset it to these 0 values here. Now because my target is also set to 0, 0, 0, what will happen if I plug this in is the sun's just going to point directly downwards, giving us no shadow, as you can kind of see here. And if we just move this over, zoom out slightly, you can see my sun there is located there, and it's just pointing down. We've got kind of no shadow being cast on the objects because it's pointing straight down at the objects. Now if we want to then vary that kind of values here, these x and y values and these z values as well, we can start to add in parameters in order to kind of vary those positions. So I'm just going to move this across again, and input it into this x, y and z. We're going to go to our parameter, we're going to find this number slider, and I'm going to put this in. We're going to just set this value. I'm going to right click, hit edit, and I'm going to set the maximum up to 10 here, and we're going to set it to whole numbers like so. So we've got a slider that goes from 0 to 10, and I'm going to copy Control C and Control V to paste this 3 times. So we've got 3 of them, and then we're just going to plug these in like so. Now what this means, and I've still got my render running, is we can then control where the sun is going with these parameters. Now you'll see it's gone quite dark here. That's because on my Z coordinate, my sun is at 0, which means it's pointing directly horizontally. And we can check that, if we just minimize that, just by this little option here. You can see it's pointing directly across, whereas if we up the Z coordinate, it's going to raise it in the sky as well. And then we can use that to tilt the sun up and down. So if we go back to our render and show it up here, and we'll just zoom in again on our scene. If we want to then start to vary that sun position, I can play around with this Z coordinate, and we're just going to make it higher to make the sun higher or lower in the sky, like so. And there you've got a way to control that position of the sun. So now we've set up our kind of sunlight, we've got our geometry working here. The next thing we're going to try and do is set up some basic materials. Now you'll notice in this geometry tab we also have this little material option, and by default it will just set it to a kind of white material if we don't set any materials in there. Now in order to make a material, we can do this back in the VRay tab And we have under the materials option this simple material option here, which we're just going to click and drag into our file. I'm going to connect that up to the material, and you can see here, as with kind of usual VRay materials, we've got diffuse, reflection, glossiness, all of these options we can start to tweak in here. Now in order to sort of play around with these, I'm going to first start with the diffuse, which is requiring a color input in order to set the color for our object. To do that, let's go back to the parameters. We're going to go to input here, and we're going to pick the color picker, which we're going to use in our scene. I'm just going to drag this across. I'm going to make it a kind of red value for now, and we're going to plug that into the diffuse. As you can see there, we've now made our model a kind of bright red color here, and we can change the saturation if we want to. We can change the sort of value of that to make it lighter or darker as well. So you can pick sort of any color or hue you want there as well. Now we've also got controls for the reflection and glossiness, and these work much like they would do when you're setting up a usual VRay material. If we copy and paste this node here, Control C and Control V to do that again, and we just push this into a kind of grey value, we plug that into the reflection, you'll notice if it's kind of white it will be very shiny, and if it's black it won't be kind of shiny at all. So that kind of controls the reflection between white and black, and similar with the glossiness, you can control it using a grayscale value as well, with white being kind of super shiny and glossy. If we up that reflection, almost like a kind of mirror finish, as you can kind of see here, and then as we scroll down it makes it very matte finish as well. So you can play around with each of those parameters just using a color input to start to kind of play with exactly what the reflection, the glossiness and these materials look like. So that's how you'll start to set up base materials in your file that you can then plug back into that render scene. Now the last thing we're going to do is set up a camera. At the moment you'll notice that the camera is just purely set by me rolling around the scene and picking a view to work with. If you want to set a specific camera, we can also set up what's called a camera node in Grasshopper as well, and this can be found back in VRay under the render tab, and we've got this VRay camera here which we're just going to drag into the scene. Now this slots in just above the lights, so what I'm going to do is we're just going to move these downwards so they've got a bit of room, and we're going to put the camera in here. Then we're going to take that camera and we're going to plug it in there. Now the way the camera works is we can give it a specific position that it's going to render out each time, so when I roll around the scene like this it won't change the field of view every time I want to render. To do that, what I'm first going to do is we're just going to minimize these views, and we're going to pick a view in the scene. And you can see once I've made that camera, it already sets up a kind of placeholder object which represents the camera in my view. Now for this view I kind of want a sort of close-up in these areas here, so maybe let's sort of pan the camera down slightly, just like we're looking at these objects here, and maybe I'll zoom it in a little bit, something like this. Once we're happy with that, I'm then going to go back to my Grasshopper file, right click on the camera, and we're going to click this Get from Active Viewport, and what that's going to do is it's essentially going to grab the camera from my view here and set it up as my active view, and if we then render that you can then see that's being rendered. Now we've set that view, you'll see as I pan around the object it's not going to move it anymore, it's kind of locked in to that viewport, and that's kind of a really good way to essentially lock your camera and set it up so that that is the view that's rendered each time, and you can see the camera little option and the icon of it here as it's being rendered. Now we also have a kind of field of view option, target position again, so we can start to use all of these inputs to change some of the features of our camera. The field of view is quite useful, so as an example let's take one of these sliders from down here. I'm just going to Control C, Control V to copy and paste it. I'm going to reset this value and let's make it a maximum of 100 this time, so it slides in between 1 and 100. We'll put it as a value of kind of 50 now, and I'm going to plug that into the field of view, and you can see here now we can kind of use this to essentially zoom in, zoom out, widen the angle of the camera there as well. So you can start to use these sliders to control some of these features in here as well. So you've got a lot of controls we can start to use and plug in to Grasshopper. Now this is essentially the base settings we need to set up our render. You can see we've got our camera, we've got our light set up here, and we've got our materials and geometry. And all of these are then being clicked into this render plugin here, this render node, that we can then render out our scene. Now if you want to sort of do a final render of your scene, the way to do this would be to make sure you've got your image output set. You then right click on your render node, and all you need to do is click render here, and obviously it will load up that tab again, and then it will start to render out your scene. And depending on the quality you have set, the resolution of your scene as well, this might take a kind of longer or shorter amount of time based upon those settings. If you want to go back, maybe you didn't set the resolution high enough, you can also set this in the output resolution here. If you hover over that output resolution option, you can see that at the moment it's got a value of 960 by 540, which represents a kind of 960 pixel wide image by 540 pixels high. If you right click on that, we can set multiple integers to reset these numbers, and I could set it, let's say we set it to 2000 by 2000 as a sort of square aspect image, and we're going to hit commit changes. That way when you hit that render button again, it will then be a square format, as we can see here, and it's rendering out at a slightly higher resolution there. Now as a kind of final thing to look at, we want to just introduce one of the main features of kind of VRay for Grasshopper and why this kind of tool is so powerful, and that tool is the timeline function, and this is found up here in the render option under timeline. Now what this does here is it essentially sets a number of frames in our scene, and it will start to set up essentially animations for us. What it will automatically do is if we plug this in, it will start to render out each of those frames sequentially from whatever number we set. Therefore, if at this stage we've got a 0 to 30 frames, it will go through and render each of those frames in our scene. And we can link this up with other properties in our scene to essentially vary perhaps the position of the lighting, the kind of camera angles, certain aspects over this time period to give us a kind of interesting features to work with when we're kind of rendering out our animations. Now as an example, I'm going to use the Z coordinate of my lighting in conjunction with this timeline to essentially make a kind of moving sun study in our scene. Now the way this can work is I'm going to move this over here, we're going to set our timeline, and we're just going to plug it into our timeline option here, so it's then connected to our render scene. Now at the moment the number of frames is set by this number, and we've got 0 to 30 frames there. That's enough for what I need to do, but if you wanted to change that, you can always plug in a node into that frames option to vary that value, and we could up it to however many frames we need. Now as well as inputting out this kind of timeline, which we're going to put in there, another output of this feature is also this frame and fraction option. And what you'll see here is the frame essentially counts the number of frames we're on. So from frame 18, this will also set to 18. And what we can do is I'm going to go over here, and instead of this Z coordinate being from 0 to 10, as you can see here, I'm actually going to take that frame option and plug it in there instead. So now the timeline is controlling that Z rather than this slider here. What this means is on frame 0 you'll see the sun is horizontal, but as we move up it will start to change. And if we actually then look at our interactive render again, and we're just going to load that up there and start to play around with our timeline, you'll see as we move through time the sun is essentially changing in the scene as well, and we can set up a sort of mini sun animation using this timeline feature. Now this is sort of super powerful. We can use the timeline and plug any of these things into any of our controls in Grasshopper to start to make quite complex animations and different sort of scenes using VRay. If you want to then render this animation out, all we then need to do is make sure we've got our image output saved, which I've got here, and then when we right click on our scene, I'm just going to stop that preview. Instead of render here, we're then going to click render animation, and all it's going to do is just start from frame 0, and it's going to slowly work through those frames, rendering out each one in turn, saving it into our file, and then moving on to the next frame until those 30 frames are finished. So what I'm going to do now is going to pause the video and let this render out, and then we're going to have a look at the resulting animation. This is now finished rendering out, and we can see each of these frames of the render have been saved in this file here. And if we sort of select them, you can kind of cycle through and see that kind of light changing through each image there. So that is just briefly how we can use kind of the Grasshopper and VRay nodes combined together to start to create animations using this function. And this is a really powerful tool that we can use for lots of different features to start to control the motion of objects, how they might develop over time, and then also the lighting settings within our render file as well. So I hope you found this video tutorial useful on how to set up a render using Grasshopper and VRay. If you want to watch any other videos on how to render, create images, drawings in Rhino and VRay, then please do check out the videos on the channel. Thanks for watching.